Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack. Welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about application development, deployment, and management at scale. GitLab is a single application for the entire software development lifecycle. From project planning and source code management to CI/CD, monitoring, and security, GitLab helps enterprises deliver software to market at new speeds. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack, and I'm here at GitLab Commit in Brooklyn, New York, the first user conference for GitLab, and I'm very excited to have with me here today Philip Schwartz. Hey, Philip.
Hi, how are you doing?
Philip is Principal Engineer, Software at T-Mobile, and Priyanka Sharma,
Hello.
Director of Technical Evangelism at GitLab. Thank you for joining us today. So I just want to go through a quick overview, okay? So, Philip, you're with T-Mobile, correct? And you were giving a presentation today on dynamically managing group permissions using GitOps and the GitLab API. So I want to look at this, kind of what you're doing with that. And I also want to talk about some of the basics of GitOps. What is GitOps? And what you really need to develop a GitOps framework. Because it really was based upon this whole premise of being declarative. And being declarative is not actually always an automatic for an organization. It may seem very almost nonsensical for you not to be declarative in some circles, where they say, well, the API really is how we communicate, right? How we pull and push information. So perhaps, Philip, we could start of what is your view on GitOps? What does GitOps mean to you?
To me, GitOps is just the next evolution of the DevOps lifecycle. The ideas of trying to manage infrastructure and software as code and configuration as code. The big push is to move down the stack to where everything is managed from a source code repository and through CI and automation, allowing us to make quick changes to a Git repository that can affect wide changes throughout our organization.
And your thoughts on GitOps? Would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I 100% agree with what Philip said. I think something unfortunate for the term GitOps has been, it's been really convoluted. Just because I think people were trying to add a lot of detail, but that got too much. But it really comes down to infrastructure as code, configuration as code, putting everything in version control regardless of what it is. And that to you brings GitOps, which enables DevOps because it's so core to the developer workflow.
When I did a story recently about Box and their path to adopting Kubernetes, they talked a lot about how GitOps became so crucial, because what they were finding was they initially tried to build their microservices on top of their monolithic architectures. And whenever they had a problem with, they would lose everything. They'd have to start all over again because you had a lot of configuration drift. And the issue that you have with monolithic architectures is they just keep everything. They're basically kind of like the code just stays in there. It doesn't get, it's not just like you're working with some ephemeral environment as you might be with containers, for example. So, I'm curious on, that aspect of GitOps, because GitOps, I think, is sometimes made overly complicated, but I always have it very simply as it sits separate from the Kubernetes architecture, for example, right? So you can think of it as not having to do all your version control in Kubernetes, but you can move it out separately as is, into the Git environment itself.
Exactly. That's one of the big goals that we've had at T-Mobile is trying to move a lot of those pieces out of the traditional location of where they might be in a database inside of the system of record and service registry for an actual environment, and more into a repository. So we're able to recreate things on the go, do it dynamically, manage our user base in a more dynamic fashion. And it's been an eye-opening experience to be able to work through the problems that you see with those systems as you're trying to get them working. And it's very interesting to see those problems solved to where you can work with them on a really finite level.
So you went through your own evolution with Kubernetes at GitLab. How did GitOps play a role at GitLab in that evolution?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as a quick refresher for folks, GitLab is a great way for people to get Kubernetes in the hands of their own developers. And for us, we use Kubernetes, and we recently started modernizing our own CI/CD, particularly the CD, and we do continuous delivery the old-fashioned way. We started doing it the old-fashioned way without Kubernetes, just because we wanted to get started and build the sort of the working muscle of every person, so that the culture of the DevOps piece is built. Now, how does that connect to the world of GitOps? Well, the key thing we were successful in building is everybody works in the interface of GitLab, and using the MR, which is the merge request, which is where there is all the, which is similar to pull request, but that some other people think of. That MR has all of the information, and within that MR, dev, sec, and ops, developer, security, and operations people can go in and see results from, let's say, code scans or code quality, etc., and resolve things right there. So you see something, you push a new commit, and it's solved. So everything is coming into the version control story, right? Now, is that conventional GitOps? I can't answer that. I feel like we haven't come to a canonical definition, but the way I see it, where infrastructure and configuration as code is this, kind of like what you were saying, Philip, like putting things in the repo, like TLDR, everything in the repo, everything in the pull request. Yes, that's what we did.
Interesting. So when you're talking about managing permissions with GitOps, what is it that you're really talking about today in your discussion?
With T-Mobile, we went all in on the GitLab.com SaaS offering. Instead of trying to run GitLab server local inside of our on-prem environment, we wanted to leverage the expertise of the GitLab.com team for managing the actual platform and the scalability of it. One of the problems that comes in with that is you don't have the traditional ability to connect your actual GitLab user accounts via Active Directory directly to the GitLab server. So you end up having to use a SAML authentication tool, and in this case we're using Okta. And what you end up with is all of the users with base access to your primary group, and that's it. As you start building up your actual data set in all of the repositories, you end up having a lot of subgroups and projects underneath those, and you need to be able to manage the user base and what they have access to. And my talk today is a cut-down version of what we're working towards and doing inside of T-Mobile to store inside of YAML files, inside of specific projects, inside of GitLab, a base overview of what all users should see permission-wise, whether the user's a maintainer, a developer, an owner of a specific group or subgroup or project. And then we're using the GitOps workflow of every time there's a merge request that comes into those, the individual team that owns that section of the actual code base, that subgroup, that project, is able to actually do the approval process and get those users added in and have the actual CI process contact the GitLab API to add the permissions to the individual users and groups. It basically is mimicking the ideas of what we see inside of Active Directory, LDAP, where you're defining the directory tree, but instead of doing it inside of an external system, we're doing it inside of Git directly and using the CI system to manage it all.
Amazing.
That's correct. That's fascinating. So, has it allowed T-Mobile to lower the barrier to entry
That's one of the exact things we're actually trying to solve with it. Previously, in our older environments, users would have a couple days between getting ServiceNow tickets in, getting Active Directory access requests done to get access to everything. We've moved to where we're working right now at about a 30-minute lag time of getting users added to the groups, access to the systems, and then be able to immediately start opening merge requests to request access to specific sections of our code base. Our goal is to get that to under 5 minutes and be able to have users very quickly ramp up, get access to the system, immediately open up merge requests that individual teams get to approve, and be able to say, oh yeah, this user should have access to this section of our code base.
Wow. And how many engineers is T-Mobile?
So we're broken up into a few different organizations. The section of the company I work for is product and technology. Currently, we have active between employees and non-traditional workers, contractors, upwards of 9,000 users, and we're targeting this system to support somewhere between 12 and 15,000 developers within T-Mobile. And as you can see, that's just a large number to have somebody have to manage inside the UI, go and individually click add a user into individual groups, and take care of that management. Having it into the repositories where users can actually go in and use that GitOps workflow of open a merge request, add their username to a specific project or group, and then wait for that team to actually approve it is a very eye-opening process for a lot of the users. It gets their access much quicker than most traditional sets.
So 5-minute onboarding at a company like T-Mobile with like 12, up to 12, 15,000 people. I feel like that's such a key point, right? Is like, yes, if you're a 3-person startup, you onboard in 2 seconds.
Right.
But to do it
Right.
at that scale is really impressive to me.
Right. Yeah, another question I have then is about scale. Since you have such a large group who are using GitOps, what are the challenges you face with scale when GitOps starts to scale out?
The biggest challenge is really managing our GitLab runners to be able to handle a lot of this functionality.
Maybe you can explain what a GitLab runner is.
So a GitLab runner is the core component of GitLab CI. It's an individual piece of software that's sitting and running, registered to GitLab, and basically pulling a queue, waiting for work to happen. The problem that we've run into is the finite set of resources that we're using on those runners. The more things that are making requests into GitLab's API via GitOps, we see a lot more API requests happen, which cause a lot more back-off limiting. So right now, all of the APIs from GitLab will return back-offs with a wait time that you have to wait before you can do more queries depending on how many things have been done. So the more and more users we have, the more often those things are hit. And one of the big things that we've been looking at to try to come around that is the newer API set for GitLab that's now on GraphQL that doesn't have that rate limiting. So we can start trying to work around those type of limits, trying to do everything in batches so we can coordinate how fast things move through instead of having to rate limit them.
Have you had to deal with that? You know, yeah, GitLab itself. I mean, are there scale issues that you've come across?
So GitLab running on GitLab has been a pretty successful experience.
Right.
And it's not been the exact same issue just because they use .com and we use...
Your own.
Yes, exactly. To be fair also, Maren is the extraordinary leader who leads that team and can share a lot more on the nitty-gritty of that. But to the best of my knowledge, no.
So when you're dealing with that, so the GraphQL has been a transition then for you. So have you started to adopt that?
Yeah, we've started to work our code base into starting to make queries to GraphQL. Right now, one of the big pieces of GraphQL that's already implemented is the group API. So we've started to move a lot of our queries against the group API to use GraphQL so we can avoid using the REST API and a lot of the underlying aspects. One of the things that we are hoping for as things move forward is the target outline for GraphQL for replacing the APIs is to have all of the REST APIs actually use the GraphQL APIs underneath. So there might even be that point where we won't even hit those type of rate limiting and backoffs because those are specific to how the HTTP handlers for REST are. And if the REST stuff is actually hitting GraphQL we are able to see that as an abstracted out issue. But it hasn't stopped us from already starting to use those APIs, which are coming along from the community.
So the API is consuming the API. It's like, wow.
It's an inception API.
It's an inception API. That's the quote of the day. So, are you seeing more customers use GitOps?
Yes, absolutely. I think GitOps is a pretty customers, users, ecosystem partners, everyone is getting on that bandwagon. But the interesting piece I've noticed is that people may or may not call it GitOps, right? People think more from the perspective of, okay, how do I make this easy for my developers to get going? How do we just move along? And when you are thinking about workflows and how to move a large or small developer workforce, the best way is to adapt to what they're used to. And that's what GitOps brings to the table. Today in the keynotes, it announced how our partnership with HashiCorp is deepening. So GitLab plus Terraform is very well used now. There's a customer called VAG Labs who's done lots of presentations on it. So by default, when you do those kinds of combinations, you're getting on the GitOps train. Same is coming on the for DevSecOps with the upcoming GitLab plus Vault integration. Already, folks are actually using GitLab, Vault, Terraform together in a very nice, healthy manner, because that way they're bringing DevSecOps with GitOps to their organizations. So I think many people are doing it. Flavors may be slightly different, but ultimately it's about bringing things to the developer in the way they know how to work already.
How are you managing your teams before you started adopting GitOps? What were the practices that you used?
Inside of T-Mobile, the majority of things were managed very manually, unfortunately. There would be a lot of requests going back and forth through ServiceNow and a management layer in front of Active Directory, and it would be adding users into Active Directory groups, managing when they get removed, if they get disabled, and then it would unfortunately fall down to where our previous SCM system, where users would actually have to go in and manually add users to specific projects and groups and set their permissions. And it was a very long, drawn-out process, which was part of what led to that multi-day ramp-up period that most of our users would see.
So that's where the multi-day ramp-up really did have its effects. And so now, does that make you more of a software company, this process?
We've always seen ourselves as a software company. We have, throughout T-Mobile, close to 700 different applications that run many aspects of the business, from things underneath down to things that our actual customers see. We're just working now to make sure that we're not just consuming those applications and consuming the different pieces of software, but we're working on how to automate them to work together. And that's one of our big keys, is to find out how we can automate the entire stack, from the start of a developer's workflow and their process through every step of CI, out to deployments to all of the environments and testing, and how all of that can be coordinated as one. And I think that's one of the big things that GitOps helps to get to us, is we're able to start with the first part of what we're doing, managing users with their ramp up and how they can access stuff, but then we're also doing a big push throughout T-Mobile, moving a lot of stuff to infrastructure as code, managing databases as code. That way we can really get to the point of having everything coming from that single source of truth.
So you must be thinking more about monitoring then and observability issues, especially if you're having, because you may have multiple rollbacks in a day, for example, right? If there's, if something needs to be changed, for example, and you can do that easily with Git. But there's lots of data that's being transmitted all the time. It's like a hive. So has this put a higher premium on monitoring and observability for you?
It's put a higher premium on monitoring and observability, and it's also made us think a lot more about the storage of that data and how we can obtain it and work with it in the future. A good example, as we started ramping up our first set of users on GitLab, we've started to pull a lot more metrics out of our GitLab runners and our process, trying to be able to watch what's happening and get a lot more observability into it. and we're averaging almost 50 billion data points a month at the current rate from just that small subset. So we're looking to see what we have to do to target a much larger storage base, how we're able to work with it, and the tooling around that, which for our team is not something we've had to focus with before. There's teams inside of T-Mobile that have focused with massive amounts of data that's related to our cell phone network and related to the actual network communications and how things function, but we're now looking at those type of problems at our level, which makes things a lot more interesting throughout the day.
That creates a greater need for time series analysis, doesn't it?
Correct. A greater need for time series analysis, a greater need for being able to do log storage and log analysis, and trying to have tools that can have work through an entire data pipeline to really manage it for us so we can see it.
Your ears must be just...
I know.
Your gears must be really whirling because you probably hear about these things a lot.
Oh, absolutely. And my ears really perked up at that 50 billion data point because later today, I'm running a panel about how does data engineering change in the world of cloud native? What do we think of as data ops today? And the whole reason we set up this panel was because with modern day software, where every company is a software company, just the more complexity you have, the more services you have, the more data points are generated, the more GitOps you do, the more data points are generated. How do you understand all that? How do you make sense of all that information?
Yeah.
And so that's what we're going to talk about right after. And of course, there's the observability side, which we could keep talking about.
Yeah, so I guess my last question is, where do you go from here with GitOps?
So the next stage of where we're seeing it with GitOps is not just managing our current user base and the current CI/CD tools. We've started looking at how we can spin GitOps with management of policy files with things like Open Policy Agent to be able to define how we can use things inside of our environment, how our users can run GitLab CI projects by being able to enforce policies across all of these projects.
And that's what Open Policy Agent does.
Correct. And we've been looking at how we can start integrating a lot of those things with GitOps or automating the process, automating the whole state of a user where they get from their first commit to code being released and being able to work with it and see a lot more through it and providing those tools to our users.
What's the next evolution for GitOps and GitLab?
Oh, it's a continuous evolution. And so it's not going to be staged. It's more and more of our developer workflows is infrastructure as code, configuration as code. And as we modernize ourselves, for example, we have gone to continuous delivery without Kubernetes. We're going to go to continuous delivery with Kubernetes soon. So that just, expands the use of GitOps in the way we do business.
So as you continue to find your own ways to automate, you'll be using GitOps as a primary way to do that.
I think everybody, that's what I was saying. I think everyone's using GitOps in one way or another. We're just now realizing that that
this is GitOps.
Yeah, exactly. And I actually think
because Git's the source of truth.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things when you say what's the next evolution, in addition to how we're doing things, we take it upon ourselves as an imperative to share with other people how we do things, right? And that's something very important as a Git-based company, as a company doing DevOps, that we share with others. This is how we did it. Maybe this is useful to you. And I just want to have the ecosystem learn more about GitOps.
Great. Well, this has been really interesting to hear your perspective on GitOps and GitLab and how it's evolving as well. We've talked a lot about what GitOps is, and so thanks for helping with that definition, how you've implemented GitOps, how it's scaled inside your company, how you think about monitoring and observability and and the actual analysis of the data and where it goes from here. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
GitLab is a single application for the entire software development lifecycle. From project planning and source code management to CI/CD monitoring and security, GitLab helps enterprises deliver software to market at new speeds. Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.